Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Every Man for Himself, Virtue and the Body. The moral exemplars praised in the Confucian classics, the great sages Yao and Shun and Kongzi himself, are meant to inspire us. Their comprehensive virtue, shown in the smallest of gestures from the way they walk to the way they eat and even how they sleep, is probably nothing we could ever achieve. But we can try to emulate them nonetheless, steering by their conduct as by the pole star, as we saw Kongzi saying. If we actually met such a person, though, our reaction might be very different. We might well be annoyed. After all, those of us who are imperfect are apt to be provoked by those who seem perfect. We are apt to feel judged, even if only implicitly. When we think of Kongzi sitting down decorously on his mat, it's harder for us to enjoy sprawling on the sofa, eating potato chips and watching Netflix. As Mengzi tends carefully to the sprouts of virtue born within him, we look within our own selves and mostly find unruly desires, resentments, and ambitions. Actually, when you think about it, aren't these Confucians rather self-righteous? Where do they get off telling us that they have made their lives into a moral work of art, when deep down, or even not so deep down, they are surely no better than us? An ungenerous response, no doubt, but not an unlikely one, as we can see from the fact that some of the early Confucians' contemporaries reacted to them in just this way. Opponents delighted in pointing out any signs of weakness or hypocrisy, sometimes suggesting that the Confucian way was to act virtuous only so long as the circumstances made it relatively easy to do so. When the going got tough, the mask would drop, and the Confucians would act just like anyone else. Thus the Luxue Chunchu alleges that Kongzi abandoned his principles when in dire straits and threatened by starvation, for example by unjustly accusing a companion of taking more than his share of food. The Confucians could not let this challenge go unanswered. One line of response has been identified by recent interview guest Mark Csikszentmihalyi. As he shows, they stated that virtuous persons can be identified not just by their actions, but by their physical appearance. The truly good have a facial complexion comparable to jade in warmth and smoothness. Mengzi says that the benevolence of the exemplary person manifests itself in his face, giving it a sleek appearance. It also shows in his back and extends to his limbs, rendering their message intelligible without words. Especially the eyes are a telltale sign of moral character, because the benevolent person's eyes are clear and bright, and the wicked man's clouded and murky. So how, asks Mengzi, can a man conceal his true character if you listen to his words and observe the pupils of his eyes? There was a physical explanation for this. In exemplary persons, the life spirit called qi, about which we'll have more to say in a later episode, is in an ideal healthy state, and this makes itself seen in the person's shining eyes. Furthermore, if the exemplary person were forcing themselves to be good, grudgingly but dutifully carrying out the demands of filial reverence, then that would be clear from their appearance. When asked to show obedience to his parents, a resentful son might briefly flush with anger before forcing himself to act appropriately, or might carry out his tasks with stiff or peremptory motions. If you want to know how the son really feels about his parents, watch how he sets the table for dinner. It may be with this in mind that Kongzi says, when asked about filial reverence, it is the demeanor that is difficult. The truly dutiful son is like the one described in a passage from the Book of Rites. The filial child's deep caring is such that he will certainly have harmonized qi. If the child has harmonized qi, then he will certainly have a glad countenance. If he has a glad countenance, then he will certainly have a congenial appearance. A filial child is like one who grasps the jade and presents the full vessels, doing so seriously and attentively as if about to drop them. It should be evident why this would help the Confucians respond to the charge of hypocrisy. If character is shown so clearly by appearance, then you can't convincingly fake benevolence or filial reverence. Those who are truly righteous are not like the village worthy, only making a show of virtue. Rather, their virtue both goes all the way down and shows on the surface. This phrase, going all the way down, is more than a metaphor. Qi flows throughout the body, so insofar as its healthy state is correlated to, or even causally related to, benevolence, this virtue is part of the person's physical makeup. Similarly, in the famous passage about our instinct to save the child who falls into a well, Mengzi goes on to compare the sprouts of virtue to the four limbs of the body. He extends the bodily comparison by saying that those who fail to tend the sprouts are crippling themselves, whereas the carefully nourished sprout will flourish like a spreading fire or flowing spring. Reflecting on all this, Csikszentmihalyi has argued that the Confucians located the virtues within the body. Caring properly for one's own body and tending to its natural powers would be part of moral cultivation. Indeed, it would just be the same as moral cultivation, because the seeds of virtue are implanted within the body and are realized in physical form. Like the ostentatiously virtuous person, this theory may seem too good to be true. We can hardly accept its suggestion that unattractive people, to say nothing of disabled people, must lack virtue. Indeed, this implication was challenged even within the Confucian tradition. A disciple and supposed grandson of Kongzi, named Zisi, is said to have pointed to the varying physical appearance of figures like Yao, Shun, and the Duke of Zhou. We know, he said, that some sages had hairless legs or a hunchback. To be a sage is a matter of virtue, says Zisi. How could it be a matter of appearance? For another thing, we actually expect virtuous people to sacrifice their own bodily welfare for the sake of virtue when necessary. An obvious case would be risking physical harm or death to help another person, but a more instructive example might be the legendary Emperor Yu, famous for his engineering projects that prevented flooding. He appears several times in the Mengzi, which says that Yu was so dedicated that he spent 8 years traveling to improve the water system, and didn't even go home when he passed his own door. Echoing this story, the legalist work Han Feizi says that Yu worked until all the hair was worn off his legs. Nowadays, a man with smooth legs is probably a professional cyclist. Back then, it was evidently a proverbial physical defect. We are meant to understand that this emperor's spectacular self-sacrifice took a toll on his body. So here, physical debility is actually a sign of virtue, not a sign of its lack. You might think that everyone would have admired Emperor Yu. What's not to like about this hard-working and civic-minded fellow with an intimate knowledge of drainage systems? Well, at least one ancient Chinese thinker would have piped up to differ with mainstream opinion. His name was Yang Zhu. We have no surviving work by him, only remarks about him in other sources, most notably in the Mengzi. In 2 key passages, Yang Zhu is paired with and contrasted to Mozi, so that Yangism and Muism are presented as antithetical moral approaches. This has the effect of allowing Mengzi's own Confucian ethical theory to emerge as a happy medium. As we'll also be exploring in future episodes, Mozi's ethics was based on the idea of inclusive care. We should have concern for all others regardless of the relationships we have to them. Tellingly, Mozi inferred from this principle that one should treat their friends as they treat themselves, and the Chinese can literally be translated here as treat their bodies as they treat their own. Clearly then, the Moists would admire Emperor Yu, who saw so clearly that it was worth sacrificing his own health to save the lives and livelihoods of so many of his subjects. According to Mengzi, Yang Zhu had precisely the opposite opinion. He says of him, even if he could benefit the empire by pulling out one hair, he would not do it. It may be no coincidence that hair loss appears both here and in the story of Emperor Yu. Yang Zhu would never have made the mistake of Yu, running down his body for the sake of others. So, whereas the Moists give no special consideration to their own welfare, or the welfare of those close to them like their family members, the Yangists are concerned only with their own welfare and are entirely unmoved by the plight of others. Mengzi laments that these 2 extreme views have become prevalent in the empire of his day, and adds, I wish to safeguard the way of the former sages against the onslaughts of Yang and Mo, and to banish excessive views. Whoever can, with words, combat Yang and Mo, is a true disciple of the sages. This passage makes it sound as though Yang Zhu was an important figure on the intellectual scene, so modern-day scholars have exerted themselves to try to reconstruct his thought and explain how he came to hold what has been called the unfathomably radical view that one has no moral obligations towards others. Given the state of our evidence, it's possible that this Yang Zhu was chosen or created as a spokesperson for egoism or self-interested hedonism. Or we might be less skeptical and assume that there really was a trend of egoist thought in the period, which we could call Yangism, but while remaining agnostic about whether a specific thinker named Yang was really the driving force behind that movement. One idea in our sources, especially the early ones, is that Yang Zhu was simply an unserious argument monger, not really adopting any developed moral theory, but just juggling with words. Thus, the aforementioned Han Feizi also pairs Mozi and Yang Zhu and says that they are debaters who ought to have their mouths clamped shut, while the Zhuangzi says that these two philosophers might as well have been playing at stacking balls up into a pile. Yang Zhu's reputation as an unprincipled debater may find an echo in the Mengzi also, which in a third passage about him doesn't bother to explain the Yangist teaching, but just says that those who desert the Moist school are sure to turn to that of Yang, and amusingly adds that those who debate with either group are like people chasing strayed pigs. The much later Neo-Confucian philosopher Wang Yangming, taking his cue from Mengzi, assumed that Yang Zhu's principle must be the opposite of Mozi's. Since the Moist starting point is concern for others, the Yangist starting point must be doing right by oneself, which Wang Yangming calls rightness. Wang offered a rather sympathetic interpretation of both views, saying that Yang Zhu overshot the mark, just as the Moist did in the other direction. In this comment, Wang implicitly recognized that they were each grounded on correct principles. For Yang Zhu, this meant that we really do need to be on guard against injustice, and we should not accept less than we are due. Karine Defort, in her examination of different portrayals of Yang Zhu, comments that it was important for the Confucians to address the Yangist and Moist principles as they posed challenges to the Confucian vision. This threat was felt early on and expressed in the Mengzi, which viewed the Yangist vision as detrimental to society and not just overshooting the mark, because Yang renounces the authority of the ruler in favor of looking after himself. Another negative image of Yang Zhu talks about him weeping at the crossroads. This remark was made in the Xunzi, in a discussion about the choice of worthy men as advisors. Yang Zhu wept sadly, as he apparently was unable to select such men for official posts. Xunzi also said that at these crossroads, one may take a half step wrong only to discover later that one has gone astray by 1,000 miles. As Xunzi saw it, Yang Zhu understood that this was an important process, but perhaps because Yang Zhu was not seriously engaged in being a worthy official, he could not make these selections. It's interesting to see the layered interpretations of Yang Zhu over time, expressed from the perspectives of those evaluating his views from their own standpoint. All the more frustrating that we have no surviving writings of Yang, if he even had writings. In fact, the caricatures of Yang Zhu, many of them negative, seem ironically to have played into his worry that politics is a dirty game. As far as we know, his views did not endanger his life, but many years after his death, his reputation continued to be sullied. In any case, the representations of Yang Zhu are not always so negative. We have seen how Wang Yangming, a Neo-Confucian thinker, thinks that Yang Zhu overshot the mark in advocating for his own well-being, and this suggests that Yang Zhu was not an entirely unprincipled egoist. He became unpopular because his views bucked the trend. Instead of emphasizing the responsibilities of rulers and officials and upholding collective welfare, Yang Zhu advocated keeping careful watch over one's own well-being. Hardly an appalling thing to propose, especially for an official for whom the dangers of getting entangled in political intrigues would include losing one's life. This could also help explain why Yang Zhu was apparently focused on his own body, as opposed to other things a self-interested person might be after, like wealth or indeed a happy family life. A couple of other sources, which explore his ideas in more detail, present Yang Zhu as having an abiding interest in the pleasures of the body. These are first the Lu Shu Qunchu, also known as Lu's Annals, a work compiled around 239 BC, whose title alludes to the Confucian historical treatise we talked about in episode 4, and is not to be confused with that text. And then second, the Liezi, a compilation written in the 3rd or 4th century CE. That was a good 6 centuries after the supposed life of Yang Zhu, so the Liezi can hardly be treated as a well-informed witness, but it is still worth examining, along with Lu's Annals, as a fairly detailed portrayal of Yangism. In Lu's Annals, Yang Zhu is credited with a policy of letting the eyes enjoy visual beauty, the ears pleasing music, and the mouth delicious flavors. Life is relatively short and full of sorrows. Both the wise and the foolish die, whether after a decade or after a century, so we have only limited opportunity to gratify our desires and should take those opportunities whenever they come. Likewise, we should do our best to avoid anything that might bring suffering or unhappiness, like, say, running around setting up engineering projects for the whole empire, or serving in the army. If we accept that power corrupts, Yang Zhu's philosophy is not entirely out of place. Besides, why should we not look after our own health? The Yangist emphasis on caring for one's own body does not merely caution us to look after our physical health, it incorporates the concept of human nature, xing, which is the natural makeup of who we are, with emotional, intellectual, and spiritual aspects. From Yang Zhu's perspective, we should seek to preserve these original characteristics of humanity. This version of Yangist philosophy boils down to advice found in the Liezi: abandon yourself to life and allow it to run its course, exhaust all your desires, and wait for death. Abandoning oneself to life and exhausting one's desires would include the pursuit of pleasures, of course, but that doesn't seem to be the main point. As Erica Brindley remarks in a study of the material in the Liezi, the philosophy is more life-affirming than hedonistic. The starting point is not that pleasure is good, but that we should, as it is put in another source, preserve life, maintain the real, and not get entangled with things. It's also worth mentioning an ambiguity in the most famous story about Yang Zhu. Did Yang refuse to sacrifice a hair to benefit the empire, as Meng Zi puts it, or was the point that he would not sacrifice a hair to gain the empire? That would put Yangist philosophy in quite a different light. Rather than promoting egoism, it would caution us against a seductive but grinding political life that corrupts original human nature. There's no doubting that many of our ancient Chinese reporters, particularly those who were sympathetic to Confucian ideals, did understand Yangism to be self-centered and egoist. For Meng Zi, Yangist philosophy was represented by the phrase 为我, which means for my own sake, but could be translated everyone for himself, looking after his own person. Yet there are indications that the good of the broader society was in view here, no less than in Confucianism and Moism. When the Liezi repeats the idea that Yang Zhu would not sacrifice a single hair for the sake of the empire, it explicitly contrasts this to the attitude of the hard-working Emperor Yu. Perhaps Yu's self-abnegating approach is the wrong one, and the right approach is found with figures who voluntarily abdicated the throne, or refused to accept it when offered to them. In Lu's Annals, we likewise hear how the great sage Yao tried to designate a successor, who declined, on the basis that he needed to attend to an illness he was suffering from. The lesson to be taken from this is as follows. The empire is the weightiest thing of all, but he would not harm his life for the sake of it, and how much less for any other thing. Only the man who cares nothing for the empire deserves to be entrusted with it. This is interesting and surprising. We seem to discover here that a policy of self-interest is justified, at least in part, because it is beneficial for everyone. It's not desirable for a country to have rulers who struggle in their duties, even if these rulers have the highest moral commitment to the people. Indeed, the Liezi has Yang Zhu saying that if everyone were unwilling to give up a single one of their hairs, then the world would be well ordered. It emphasizes that the best rulers are those who are not keen to gain or to grasp the empire, on a more charitable understanding of Yangist philosophy. This advice is not only about avoiding power-hungry rulers, but applies also to well-intentioned ones. Ironically, a general unwillingness to sacrifice for the greater good could actually promote the greater good. The train of thought here might run as follows. Suppose that every time the rulers tried to start a war, no one was willing to fight because they were too concerned with their own bodily well-being. That would make it impossible to fight wars. Would that be a good thing? It depends who you ask. Meng Zi was no warmonger, but he did think it could be worth fighting a war to establish political unity and stability. This would be an application of the method of expedience, or adapting to the situation, in Chinese, xuan. The Meng Zi illustrates this concept with the example of being willing to touch your sister-in-law to save her from drowning. To do so is a violation of the ritual norm that one should avoid contact with her, but that is obviously warranted given the circumstances. In much the same way, violence is generally frowned upon, but may be initiated by a benevolent ruler, so long as it promotes peace and the well-being of the state in the longer run. We can understand Yang Zhu's teaching to reject this kind of rationalization. On this interpretation, the point of the example of pulling out a hair is rather different. It is in fact a slippery slope argument. Once you start harming bodies for the sake of the state, in however trivial a fashion, you're in the business of weighing up how much harm can be permitted to achieve a certain desired goal. In fact, a later Moist text explicitly defines xuan as weighing light and heavy in respect of the body, and gives the example that one should be willing to lose a finger to avoid losing a whole hand. Yang Zhu did not want people to think this way. They should always avoid suffering and embrace the best things life has to offer. If everyone were to do this, not least our political leaders, then wouldn't we all be better off? If this is the idea, then Yang Zhu was not, after all, diametrically opposed to Mozi, as Mengzi would have us believe. Of course, Yang Zhu did not share the Moist principle of inclusive care. To the contrary, he thought that everyone should focus on taking care of themselves. But the results would be similar, if it is really true that self-interest, when universally adopted, promotes universal welfare. Being more open to considerations of expedience, the Confucians were effectively reminding their readers that if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. The Yangists preferred to adopt the eggs point of view. Having looked at various portrayals of Yang Zhu, we are now ready to lay this work to rest and hatch a new plan, namely to turn to the third great Confucian text of antiquity, the Xunzi, which, as we'll see, rejects the sunny side of Mengzi's philosophy, in particular his optimistic view of human nature. We'll egg you on to join us for that by asking, why did the chicken cross the road? To enjoy the hilarious yolks in the next episode of The History of Philosophy in China.